Lovely to see you all here this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started with our class, somewhat late, but at least we're going to get started with it here. Last week we took a look at the video. We're going to watch it again because we watched it right at the end of class, and I do want us to kind of remember the context because we haven't had a chance to really talk about this yet. But we've watched Frank Abagnale go through, as a young man, he's still not even, I don't think even 18 years old yet, but he's been going through and systematically stealing from banks, basically, by writing bad checks, and racked up a huge debt to society. At the last count that we saw in the movie, $1.3 million. It's already gone beyond that to a certain extent. But then we saw, in the last couple of weeks that we've looked at this, we've seen him begin to try to create some ties. Up until that point, he was basically traveling around using the airlines and using his disguise or his assumed identity as an airline pilot to travel around and write checks all over the country without consequence. But then we see him in not this last week, but the week before that, we see him beginning to impersonate a doctor. And then we saw some of the problems that came along with trying to do that. But nevertheless, we saw that he was trying to do that, and he began to develop relationship with people that didn't necessarily make him want to go and leave the way he had been before, because he didn't really have any ties before that other than his family, who he was kind of estranged from. So last week we saw him begin to impersonate a doctor and then begin to date this young woman whose father is a lawyer they were in Georgia, I believe, and her father's a lawyer in Louisiana. And so he goes there with this girl engaged to her to meet her parents, and that was kind of where we left off last week, was looking at this contrast between things that are happening in his life where he is getting closer to a family and beginning to try to create some kind of connections, and on the other side of it where the FBI is getting closer and closer to actually catching him. And so we're going to take a look at that video again, and then we're going to talk about it some, because like I said, last week we didn't get a chance to talk about it any. So, it'll help if I turn my volume on, almost certainly. Oh, wait a minute, this is not the right thing. Sorry, we got to go further than that. And I still got to turn my volume. Maybe. Well, there it is.
Marriage. I have to let you know.
No, let's try this again.
Oil? So what are you, Frank? Because I think you're about to ask my daughter's hand in marriage. I have to let you know.
Oh, what, sir?
The truth. Tell me the truth. What are you doing here? What does a man like you doing, Brenda? If you want my blessing, if you want my daughter, I'd like to hear it from you now.
The truth is, sir, that
Have we seen this? Okay. I think I've gone too
the
far.
truth is that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an airline pilot. I'm nothing really. I'm just a kid who's in love with your daughter.
No. You're a romantic. Men like us are nothing without the women we love. I must confess, I'm guilty of the same foolish whimsy. I proposed to Carol after 5 days with 2 nickels in my pockets and holes in my shoes because I knew she was the one. So go ahead, Frank. Don't be afraid. Ask the question you came here to ask me.
Sir, what would I have to do to take the bar here New Orleans.
The other question.
Right through that door. Good luck, Mr. Connors.
Thank you.
You know what I could ever figure out? Richard Jr. Larry families, yeah.
What's the difference?
So much to testify in.
Carl, I'm going to prison for a long time. Seriously, what's the difference?
It's a simple question.
You need Daddy Claire?
Yeah. Save that for later.
You want to split it with me?
No.
Give me half Daddy Claire and I'll tell you.
We'll figure it out sooner or later.
A little hard to tell. And I apologize, I actually jumped forward one scene from the previous one, but it kind of follows on, so we'll kind of talk about them together. The previous scene had him initially meeting her parents and this sort of awkward encounter where he claims to be Lutheran and yet he doesn't actually have any understanding of how to say a prayer and some of those kinds of things. At the same time, we see the FBI getting closer and closer to him because they're finding the last place that he was living in Georgia, and they're getting closer to his location, and they're realizing that he has now he's now impersonating a doctor, but also that he can't change his name anymore because of the fact that he's got this. He's beginning to develop these ties to people, and so that's what he's looking for, or that's what they're looking for. So now we see him meeting with the girl's father, and then after that, of course, there's a flash forward actually that happens with what's on the airplane there. That's actually takes place about a year later after he's been caught. And so this movie the movie begins actually with the premise that he's already been caught at the beginning of the movie, and so we're flashing back to these different things that kind of are the scenes that get him to the end of the movie, or the beginning of the movie where he's under arrest. But okay, so what do you see in these two scenes? Thinking back to the one from last week and then the one we've looked at today, what do you see in here that jumps out at you from the standpoint of what we've been talking about, which is the spiritual applications of this kind of a situation, of this duplicity, and these kinds of things that Frank is doing and that the people around him are being impacted by?
He's starting to get tired.
Okay, so one of the things is that he's starting to get tired of running around all the time. What is he getting tired of specifically? Does it seem like?
The duplicity.
Okay, he's starting to get tired of having to lie all the time, and he's starting to get tired of having to go and move all the time, having to hide all the time. So he wants to develop relationships, he wants to be more honest, and there's a couple of times we've seen already where he has actually, I think, twice at least already that we've seen where he has told the truth to people, but they haven't believed him entirely because of the circumstances. The first time was when he called Carl up and told him what room he was actually in and what hotel he was actually in, and Carl didn't believe him. And then we see it here again with the girl's father, where he actually does tell him what he is, but in a way that is designed to not necessarily cause him to believe him so much as just to give him an answer that's going to continue the lies. So he's definitely getting tired of what he's doing. And we're going to pursue, we'll talk about it. So what does that have to do with the spiritual world and what we encounter as Christians?
I guess I'm picking it up from the other side, though. It seems like that we're willing to believe a lie.
Yeah.
That we're trained mentally to believe that everybody's telling the truth, and even when they're lying to us, we accept it as the truth.
Yeah. Okay, you're absolutely right, but I want to hold on that for a second, because I want to come back to that, because that's the other, I think, really big point that comes out of this. But before we get to that, what I want to talk about, because what's happening in the movie is, the more you watch the movie, as you go through it, you start off, and initially it's just kind of funny how easy he could get people to do what he wants them to do. And then you start to realize how damaging that is, especially if you've worked in a law enforcement field, or if you worked as a prosecutor, when you see, or you know from if you understand finance and the fact that you're not just taking money from banks, that's causing everybody harm and raising the cost for everybody else. It starts being so much funny as it is you start to see how destructive that is. And you see how he's taking advantage of people and sort of using people. But as you go through the movie, what you start to see more and more of is the recognition that while he is the criminal in this, you also start to see how the fact that he is the criminal is not to his best interests either, and that he becomes more and more unhappy with the situation in which he finds himself. And I think it's important for us to remember that when we watch or when we think about most people who are doing bad stuff, while we do and rightfully do say that's wrong and that's sinful and that's a problem, as Christians, our attitude also needs to have an element of, but part of the reason why the gospel exists is for people like that, just like it's for people like us. And so when we think about somebody like Frank, on the one hand, he is the problem that needs to be solved. And we've been talking about the things that he does in the context of the problems that that kind of falseness can create in the church. But we also have to realize that he is still a boy, basically, who's making really, really bad decisions and causing a lot of harm, and there's no question about that, but also someone who is lost and who needs to find, or who at least God would want to have find their way out of that. And so when we look at that in that way, we start to recognize, or we start to understand that even as we want him to be caught because he needs to be held accountable for his actions, we also can see in him the desire to stop doing some of those things. And maybe not to do them in a healthy way. His approach would be to just stop doing them with no consequences. And we know that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, this increasing desire to get free from what he has done and what he's doing is something that we all should be able to identify with to a certain extent. We may not always want to admit it to ourselves, but the reality is that all of us have done things that we wish we hadn't done, and have wished we could get past them or get out of them, or that people would let it go, or whatever it might be. And all of us have struggled to deal with the consequences of mistakes that we've made. And maybe those haven't been really huge consequences the way his are shaping up to be, but there are always going to be consequences. And if we don't experience that, then we're probably either lying to ourselves or we are ignoring something, because that's just a reality. And so as he is becoming more aware of what's missing in his life, the fact that, yeah, he's got money and he has the ability to scam people out of money, but he becomes more and more aware of what's missing in his life, it's clear that he is looking for a way to get past the false version of himself and to begin to create a real version of himself. But he doesn't really know how to do that, because everything in his life essentially is built on the lie. So how can you build anything on top of the lie? But when we think about that in the spiritual context, that becomes particularly relevant for us, because most of humanity, and many of us at different times in our lives, have tried to build on a foundation of a lie. And in a very real sense, that is what sin does in the lives of everybody, is we start trying to build around sin, whatever it might be. You know, whether it is some sort of an addiction, or whether it's some sort of behavior that we have that we keep allowing to come into our lives, and we put that and we protect that. We build our lives around that, not in the sense of, you know, I'm doing this and so I'm going to make my life be all around it, but we build our lives in a way that protects it, so people don't see that we're doing it, so that we can continue to do it, so that we're not held accountable for it. We build our lives around that, and the more we build on top of that, the less stable our lives become, because that truth is there, and we're just hiding it, and we're building on the lie. Jesus talks about this idea with the story of the parable of the builders who built on sand and the one who built on the rock. You build on anything but Jesus, any foundation but Him, and eventually your life is going to become unstable and it's going to collapse, even if it's not until the judgment day. At some point, what you built on is not going to last, and what you build on top of it is going to crumble away. You build on Jesus and on His teachings, and it stays forever. And that's a critical difference for us as Christians, and it's a really important thing for us to remember as Christians, that if we're not building our lives on the truth of Jesus, then we are building a structure that's not going to last, essentially. And so I think that's what's partly starting to happen, is he's starting to realize the flaws in the structure that he's built, and in particular the lack of connection to people, and the fact that he's constantly running. These are things that he doesn't like, and he's realizing the problems with what he's built, but the problem he has is he doesn't know how to build something different. He doesn't have any, his life is completely based on a lie, more so than most people's is, and it's really hard for him to find a way around that. Okay, so, Jerry.
I guess if I was watching the movie all the way from the beginning, I wouldn't come to that conclusion. I would come to the conclusion that he is just finding another way to lie to accomplish a goal, and whatever that goal might be. But I don't see, I wouldn't see watching it that he is concerned about something else. I think he's just acting further in his character of the lie that he's living.
I think you're right about that, but I think you have to think about what he's pursuing at this point in the movie. It doesn't line up with simply what is materially best for him. He's beginning to look at, you're right, he's lying to get what he wants, but I think what he wants is changing. Because it's not so much now about just getting money. Doing what he's doing, beginning to work as a doctor, and then now going and meeting this girl, going and meeting her parents, and shifting where he's, his lifestyle from one that's designed to be mobile and unconnected to one that involves ties, suggests that he wants something different. Even if he's using the lie as the way to get it, what he wants is changing, I think. And you could see that in one sense. You can understand that from the standpoint of somebody who's growing up and growing a little more mature in some ways. He starts off as a probably 16-year-old kid, doesn't really think about those things, but as he begins to get older, he starts to realize this is other stuff I want. Now, like you said, he's not thinking in terms of this is other stuff I want, so what is the right way to go about getting this? He's still thinking in terms of this is other stuff I want, so what kind of lies do I have to tell to get that stuff? And so he's not at the point where he's trying to make good choices. He's still trying to gratify what he wants. It's just that I think what he wants is changing. And I think with most people in the world, that's the beginning of their awareness of what they're missing, is a recognition that they want something different than they thought they did. They don't start off going, okay, so now I need to make good choices and I need to, convert to and start believing in God and stuff like that. But they do begin to search for something different, and that's usually where we start to have some success. Let me get David's comment, and then I'll come back to you, Jerry. David, go ahead.
Like the first time we watched the movie, you cut the clip where I was thinking, to me, he gets in this situation, and he, because they're a faith-based family, and I think what the writer was doing in this is showing, as God is your foundation, this is a family that loves each other, they're always been together. He gets a taste of that, and he realizes that's what he's been searching for, writing fake checks and having tons of money. It's not buying him happiness. So now he sees a vision of what it truly is, and I think the writer, my opinion, was like, this is a faith-based family, God is the foundation, everybody's happy, and that's really where his life starts to meld into that. So
right. And to be fair, Jerry, the clip we're going to watch in a minute here is going to help to reinforce my position. And you haven't seen it yet, so that's not exactly fair. But up until this point, I would agree with you, this is not him trying to do the right thing the right way. This is him seeing he wants something different than what he thought he did, and still thinking in terms of, and how do I get that?
But then the application to us is we need to really reinforce the value of what we have to offer.
Yes.
That, to me, that listening to what you're saying, that would be the outcome.
Yeah.
Is that spiritually we need to be able to show we're going to get peace, we're going to have that relationship. That needs to be something that we need to emphasize. Not that you're violating the scripture, but this is what you're going to gain.
Right. And I think when you know, there is a point at which we have to say to people, this is why you're hurting. This is why you don't like the way things are. This is why it feels like things are wrong in your life. And that's where we talk about sin. And that's where we talk about the effects of sin. But that's not where we stay. We don't just stay there talking about, and this is why this is wrong, and this is why this is wrong, and this is why you are wrong. And we say, you know, you feel broken. Yeah, you feel broken, but here's how that gets fixed. And that's our central message. And when you look at the New Testament and what the apostles are preaching, yes, they do preach about sin. You know, and Peter's first sermon is designed to convict the people who are listening that they've sinned by killing Jesus, and by just more broadly that they have sinned. But the important part of his sermon is, and here's what God has done to fix that. And that's what gets, and when we see people, the joy of people hearing the gospel, it's not because they're being told how wrong they are. It's because they're being told, it's because a truth that they already knew, which is how wrong they were, is being validated and then given a result, a solution. Here's how that can get fixed. And so, yeah, I think we need, as Christians, we are far better off by not just modeling good behavior so people will say, okay, that's what good looks like and when we're bad, but modeling good behavior and positive behavior so that people will say, I want to be like that. Not I want to be righteous all the time like that, but I want to be joyful like that. I want to be at peace like that. I want to have relationships with people like that. I want to not have to hide who I really am behind who people will think I'm supposed to be, so that I don't, you know, so that I'm not really ever feeling like I'm really myself. When we can offer that by showing people that that's what it looks like to be a Christian, then I think not everybody, but there are some people who are really looking for stuff like that. And they're trying to find it in a lot of places that aren't very good for them, but the church is one of the places, is the place that offers the true resolution of that problem. Steve?
The thought is kind of coming into my mind that this movie does portray very common things that exist with all people. And so the Bible talks about there's a way that seems right to a man, but leads to destruction. And so I think that if we were to use the analogy that as we're growing up, and that there's sort of this hole in our soul, our thoughts, our mind, our whatever, and it's our obligation to try and fill it, or it's our desire to try and fill that hole. And so we have choices out there, and Satan says, here's some great choices for you. This will bring you happiness, wealth, contentment, enjoyment, and, you know, uses every single thing out there. And at first it's a little bit like having dessert before dinner. You're like, yeah, this is special. But after a while you realize your hole is not being filled at all. You're just indulging in things that are not satisfying ultimately in the end. But once you discover Jesus, you discover God, you discover His Word, that way of life, you discover all of the tremendous benefits of being a Christian and following God's Word, and all of a sudden you see that this gap in your life is being filled. And maybe that's happening to Frank right now. Maybe he's in transition. He's tired of just being this unhappy person. It was fun for a while, but now it's just a burden. And so I think the answer to almost every problem in humanity is God and Jesus, period. You can say, oh no, it's this or that or 100 other things, but it really is, you're not going to ever be truly happy without God in your life.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't think, and this is the thing, where Frank is at, is where he's starting to realize, he's starting to understand that missing thing, that hole in his life exists. he's nowhere near yet wanting to do the right thing about that or make good choices about that in any meaningful way. But he is starting to realize that there's something that's missing that he can't lie his way to.
Well, the prodigal son is a good example.
Yeah.
And it didn't occur to him like in an instant either. It took
No.
a while.
First, he has to realize that he's in a really terrible situation and it's not getting any better. Now, with all of that said, though, I do want to go back to Jerry's other point, which I think is extremely well taken, and it's a really important point to make here, because we've been talking a lot about the problems of false teachers and people who come in and lie and give us bad information. And we talk a lot about the different weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we have to what they have to what they do. And this scene, along with the previous one where he first meets his fiance's father, is one where we see, I think, probably the last really big area of duplicity come out, and the weakness of Christians and of people in general come out. One of the ones that's the easiest to manipulate, which is this desire that we have to believe that people are telling us the truth and to try to impose that onto what they say to us when they seem sincere. And so, if you think about the video we watched last week, which I intended to show again, but we're just going to have to remember back, Frank he meets his fiance's father, and it's pretty clear that he doesn't really trust Frank, right? I mean, initially at least, you get a pretty good sense that because he asks him some questions that are clearly intended to draw out and to test whether he really is who he says he is, about the professor at Berkeley that he supposedly studied from, and just some other aspects of that. They're designed to try to trip him up, which suggests that her father is suspicious of Frank at the very least. And this scene begins with him asking again, what are you really? Because it's clear he doesn't entirely trust what he's saying. And certainly it's problematic that the number of different lies that Frank has piled on here, because he's everything that this family would want him to be. He's a doctor, he's a lawyer supposedly, he's a Lutheran, he's exactly, I mean, it's what, if any of us encounter somebody like this who is exactly what we wanted them to be, these days at least our first thought probably would be, this is too good to be true, or at least you think that that will be the case. And at least for the father, that seems to be the case, that he is, he's a lawyer. You'd expect lawyers to be a little more suspicious than the average person. Certainly that's been my experience. But he asks him, what are you really? And how does Frank respond to that? What does he do?
Tells the truth.
He tells the truth. That's right. He tells the truth, but not in a way that's designed to really be saying, I really am not a lawyer, not a doctor, just a boy. He says it in a way that says exactly what he is, and yet it's said in a way that he knows that the father is probably not going to believe that he's literally those things. Because he adds on, I'm just a man or just a boy in love with your daughter. And so he distracts the father from all of the inconsistencies about his story, or all of the difficult to believe aspects of his story, by bringing it back to the thing that he is most concerned about, the thing that he really cares about, which is his daughter and making sure that she's protected. And so what I want us to realize is that one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous things that we can encounter as Christians when it comes to people who are teaching false things and seeking to lead us astray, is people who will tell you enough of the truth to make you believe that it's all the truth. There is nothing more dangerous and more powerful than showing some vulnerability to someone, because they think that if you're willing to be vulnerable to them, you must be telling them the truth. And you may be telling them some of the truth, but if you're telling them a lesser vulnerability in order to cover up a much bigger problem, you haven't really revealed anything to them at all. You have simply manipulated the way that they understand the situation in order to take advantage of their confidences. The very best confidence men, outside of the telemarketer ones these days, they succeed in part because they show vulnerability in just the right way. They do things that get people to sympathize or empathize with them, and then they take advantage of it. And that's exactly what he does here. He tells him enough of the truth, all of the truth in a sense, but enough of the truth to give him the sense that he's being shown Frank's vulnerability, Frank's weakness, or whatever. And because he does that, he basically disarms her father and his natural suspicion. Because he sees him being honest, so he's being honest, therefore it must be, he must be telling the truth. And not realizing that people can lie about a lot of stuff and tell the truth about one thing, and we think, oh, well, they're telling the truth now. Why would they lie about other stuff if they're telling the truth? So it's really critical for us, I think, as Christians, as people who are seeking to make sure that we are not led astray, to recognize that that particular tactic is a particularly dangerous one, a particularly powerful one to be used. And so when we feel suspicion about someone, now there's an element of that comes from a place that's maybe not so godly, where we tend to be suspicious or we tend to be negative in our thinking. But there's also a place where that comes from where it is from God. Jesus talks about to his disciples, he says, I want you to be as wise as serpents, innocent as doves, wise as serpents. So he says, I want you to not be sinful, but I want you to be recognizing that people are sinful. And don't ignore that just because you are innocent and just because you have my presence in your life. And so as Christians, as human beings, when we feel suspicious about something, usually there's a reason for that. And it's not simply based in, cynicism or, a negative view of the universe and that kind of stuff. Usually, at least in part, it's based in how we're applying our experiences and the things that we're aware of to the immediate situation that we're involved with, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're perceiving going on. And it's important for us not to just let that go because someone else has done something that makes us feel a little better, necessarily. It's important for us to expect people, especially if we're going to put them in positions where they can teach or where they can lead, to expect people to show us a demonstration over time of their qualities and of their capabilities. That's why Paul, when he's talking to, I forget if it's Timothy or Titus, says about elders, don't appoint a new Christian as an elder. Why? What does he say to Timothy? Again, I can't remember if it's Timothy or Titus. Why does he say that?
Because they might get puffed up.
Yeah, because they might not be ready for it. Now he's actually kind of looking at it from a relatively positive perspective. At least he's not saying because they might be a wolf in sheep's clothing, but he's saying you hand that kind of authority over to somebody if you don't know they're ready for it, that can be really bad. We can take it a step further and say if you hand that kind of authority over to somebody who's intending or has the character of a person who's wanting to use it for bad things, it's really going to get bad. And so our natural suspicion, our willingness to recognize that people may not always have good motives, we shouldn't just shut that out just because somebody says or does something that touches us or makes us feel good or makes them seem like they're making themselves vulnerable to us, because that may still be concealing a lot underneath that. Now that doesn't mean we shouldn't trust anybody. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying because there's no way to live either, and that's no way to be Christians either. But just because someone looks good or just because someone has shown us, that they're human too, that doesn't mean that we should be assuming that means that we know everything we need to know.
I mean, I think taking, what's the word I'm looking for? Just like a questioning attitude. It's okay if anybody wants to say anything like that. I don't think it's unchristian to, even if you say something or one of us is like, well, is that really, and then you go back and you look at it, that's what we're supposed to do, So, I don't think there's anything wrong with that approach as a Christian. We don't have to be gullible.
No, and nothing in the Scripture says we should be gullible. Nothing in fact, everything in the Scripture says we should be testing the spirits. We should be like the Bereans, going and looking and seeing if what's being said is in the Scriptures. We should be, Paul talks about this, don't ignore the information that's out there just because somebody's presenting you something that sounds nice, And so we have an obligation to be, you're right, I can't think of the word myself either, which is unfortunate since I'm supposed to be the one who's thinking about the word here. But we should be wary, I guess, is the best word I can come up with. not paranoid. Paranoid is wary plus, everybo's out to get me.
Vigilant.
But vigilant, that's a great word. Thank you, Steve. I needed that word, okay. So vigilant is a great word for it. And we do see that come up over and over again in the scriptures, because Satan is the enemy, and the people of the earth, of the world, while they may not be realizing that they're lined up with Satan, they become the enemy when they do what he wants them to do. And so we have to be careful about that kind of stuff. And when it comes to our trust, we need to be careful how we give that to people, and in particular, we need to be careful how much we give to people before we've had a chance to test what they're saying, before we put them in a position where they can do great harm, and damage the church as a whole or many people, those kinds of things. And so, we need to be looking for. And the other thing that comes along with this, and this term has become more and more popular today, and I don't entirely like the way it's used today, because I think it's used somewhat inaccurately or it's overused. The term gaslighting. How many of you are familiar with the term gaslighting? Okay. Anybody want to try to define for me what gaslighting is? It's come to mean a lot of different things, but kind of the basis of what it means. Anybody know?
Steve, the politician, should explain it.
Okay.
Pull the knife out.
Go for it.
It's a great example.
Let me give you two definitions.
Either or.
Gaslighting, as far as what I understand it to be, is where you're supporting a position or something by throwing fuel on it or spotlighting it or giving it more credence than it's due.
Okay.
That's kind of what I think it is.
That's part of it. I think when it's used most often today, and I think this is maybe the context that's being used in more and more today, what is oftentimes meant by that is that you are trying to make it seem like it's the other person's fault. So when I see somebody doing something suspicious, something that I legitimately have reason to question, and I say, why are you doing that? That seems suspicious. And they say, oh, you don't trust me. And you just have this hardened heart, and you don't ever want to see the best in people, and you're just a mean person. They've never answered the question, why are you doing that? Instead, what they've made it into is, you're a bad person for even asking the question. You see it being used in domestic violence relationships. The classic version of this is, I hit her because she made me hit her. She keeps doing things that make me mad and I have to hit her.
When the victim becomes
Right.
the problem.
And we see this a lot in our world today. We see it certainly in those kinds of situations. We see it a lot with people who are in positions of power that get caught doing something bad. Instead of saying, I did something bad and acknowledging it, they go, well, why are you even asking me about that? There's more important things going on here. And a lot of times what you see when you're dealing with people who are doing bad things is that the quickest way for them to answer someone who's criticizing or questioning them is not to actually address the substance of what's being asked, because that's not going to go very well for them. The best way for them to address that, to fight back against that, is to turn it around and try to focus it on the other person. Either, why are you asking me that? Or what kind of a person would think that somebody else would do something like that? Or, well, you're not so great either, And some of those things might be true, but it still doesn't conceal the fact that we need to get to the truth of why that other person's doing the thing that we're concerned about. And so when someone is doing things that make us suspicious, we should not be afraid to ask questions. Now, the mistake we make is we try to do it the way the world does. We try to go and sneak our way around to finding out about them, or we try to do things on the sly without people knowing what's going on. But in the church, the principle is you bring things out in the open. You don't do things in secret. You don't hide things away. Now, we keep people's secrets. When somebody confesses something to us, we don't go around just spreading around to people. We don't gossip. We don't do those kinds of things. But when we're dealing with matters of the church, when we're dealing with interpersonal matters within the church, lying about things, hiding things, concealing things is not the solution to those kinds of things. To me, there's a big difference. I went back this a long time ago with the President of the United States. The President of the United States knows stuff that he really shouldn't tell everybody. You know, our military is doing some kind of operation, coming and telling everybody ahead of time, here's what we're planning to do. Probably not a great idea, you know. There's secrets that the president has to keep, that he knows, that maybe before he became president, he didn't even know existed, and he finds out about them, and it suddenly there's a lot of responsibility that comes with it. There's a big difference between that and something like what Richard Nixon did, which is where he's lying to the American people to cover up things that he's done. Or what his predecessor Johnson did, which was lying to the American people about what was going on in Vietnam to make it seem like things are better than it was. There's a big difference between saying, there's things I can't tell you, because it's my job not to tell you those things, and saying, I'm going to lie to you and fool you about things. One of those things we have to accept, that there are times when I can't tell you what somebody else told me. That there are times when an eldership is not going to be able to tell the congregation some things that they know about members of the church that maybe everybody in the congregation would love to know, but really doesn't have any business knowing. You know, there's a big difference between those two things. So there are times when we do keep things private, but that's very different from keeping things secret or hiding things or lying about things. And in the church, if we have concerns about someone, rather than letting that turn into a game of let's all gossip until we figure out what's true and everybody's hurt in the process, the better approach is to simply address it head on, as quickly as possible. It's when those things are allowed to fester that it becomes much more difficult to address them head on. When somebody who is not the person who should be in a position of power has been given a position of power and has been validated over and over again, and now we're trying to say, hey, there's a problem here, that's when it gets really hard to do things in a straightforward way. But at the beginning of that process, it would have been a lot easier to fix it. It's just that it's awkward and uncomfortable. And so we wait until it's such a big disaster we can't help but do something, and then we finally do something, and then it blows up, and we're shocked. And we think, well, we shouldn't have been as open about this as we were. No, you should have been open about it at the very beginning, instead of, 6 months into it or whatever else. So I think it's really important for us to recognize that one of Satan's best tools with us is the fact that we do want to believe that people are telling the truth. And that's a noble thing. But it can be used against us if either we are impressed by someone's vulnerability, or we are made to look like the villain. And I think we should be always aware of when somebody comes out, that the boy who says, look, the emperor's not wearing any clothes. If the people around start making fun of the boy, maybe we should be saying, okay, wait a minute, maybe we better listen and listen to what he's saying. Now maybe he's right, maybe he's not right. But if we don't pay attention, then we're going to be caught up in the same set of lies and deceit that everybody else is. So we have to be cognizant of these kinds of factors as we're dealing with people, particularly with people where we're going to give them positions of power or authority, or positions where they can teach or do more harm than just the average person can. Any last comments? All right, we'll take a break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back for worship.